the so-called Dying with Dignity bill that's currently before the Dáil, because that's just down the road. And because if it goes through as it is, it would raise problems for the North. But then I'm going to focus on some of the key principles that underlie the assisted dying debate in the UK, because these key principles are all too often overlooked, but it's crucially important to understand what they are. First, the Dublin Bill. This is a bill that shows signs of having been thrown together in a considerable hurry. There are sections of failed Westminster bills that have been cut and pasted into it. You can see that very, very clearly. And it doesn't even look as though it's been properly proofread. I mean, some of the sentences don't actually make sense. But that aside, it has 4 fundamental flaws. The first of these flaws is about safeguards. Now, what few safeguards the bill contains are not, when you look carefully, safeguards at all. The bill says, let's be very clear about this, that in order to qualify for either a prescription for lethal drugs, that's assisted suicide, or a lethal injection, that's administered euthanasia, a person must be A, terminally ill, B, have a, quote, clear and settled intention, unquote, to end their life, C, have the capacity to make the decision, and D, be making the decision, and open quotes, on an informed basis and without coercion or duress. Now, at first glance, that might appear fair enough, but if you look more closely, you have to ask yourself, first of all, what exactly is a terminal illness? Well, the bill states the blindingly obvious, that it's an incurable illness from which the patient is likely to die. But if you think that means it's limited to people who've been diagnosed with a terminal illness and told they've got X weeks or months to live, you'd be wrong. There's no prognosis required, no estimate of how long the person concerned is likely to live. Now, that's quite different from what we've seen on this side of the Irish Sea. The bills we've seen here have required a prognosis of 6 months or less, and they've been thrown out by both the Westminster and Scottish Parliaments. The bill before the Dáil may have the title Dying with Dignity, but the label on the tin doesn't actually match what's inside. This bill isn't just for people who are dying. This bill is also for people with fairly common chronic conditions like MS or Parkinson's or heart disease, which are incurable and which over time could have the effect of shortening their lives, but which can be medically managed and are medically managed in most cases, and with which those who have them can live for many years, even decades. There can scarcely be a street in the Republic where there aren't several people who will qualify under this bill for what it's proposing. And now let's ask, just how is a doctor supposed to establish whether a request for lethal drugs stems from a settled wish to die, or is free from pressure of one kind or another? Now, a doctor who's known a patient for a lengthy period of time, who's seen something of the patient's personal life, like their home situation, who's had discussions with them on several occasions, might just be able to do that. And for all I know, healthcare in the Republic may possibly be like that. I can only say that it ain't like that where I live in England. Here, multi-partner GP practices mean that many, if not most doctors, know little of their patients' lives, the pressures on them, their fears, generally what makes them tick, beyond what they might happen to pick up in the consulting room. My doctor knows absolutely nothing whatever about my private life, and he would be in a very poor position to assess me for assisted dying. Fortunately, I happen to know he doesn't approve of it. But there's also something that's been called doctor shopping. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. Then there's the matter of decision-making capacity. The bill defines this solely in terms of a person's thinking processes. That's to say, can the patient understand the information he's given and the consequences of the decision he's making? Now, that's important, of course, but equally important is what might be called the patient's state of mind. It's perfectly possible to have all our thinking processes completely intact, but yet to have our judgment impaired by depression or by stress or by family or other circumstances. Many terminally ill people, unsurprisingly, suffer from clinical depression as they struggle to come to terms with their mortality. A wish to end it all can alternate with a wish to live. What does the Dublin Bill have to say about that? Nothing. The bill says that a request for lethal drugs must be, quote, without coercion or duress, unquote. It's an obvious requirement, but just saying it won't make it happen. Just how is a doctor supposed to establish whether there is pressure behind a request? And it's not just bullying and arm twisting we're talking about here, though it has to be said that elder abuse is on the rise, much of it occurring within families. There's also internal pressure on terminally ill people who may want to spare their families a care or a financial burden. Official reports from Oregon, where assisted suicide for terminally ill people has been legalized, report that the wish not to be a burden is high up on the list of reasons why people there say they're applying for lethal drugs. Nearly 60% said that. Hello? Right. What does the Dublin Bill have to say about that? Once again, the answer is nothing. What all these safeguards have in common is that they're just idealistic statements of what ought to happen in a perfect world. Though they talk about freedom from coercion, about mental capacity, about a settled wish to die, they don't require a doctor considering a request to take any minimum steps to ensure that these conditions exist. In effect, the bill has no safeguards at all, only broadly worded conditions. It's all to be left to the individual doctor's subjective judgment. Now let's move on to the second of the bill's 4 flaws. This is the requirement that decisions on who should and should not receive lethal drugs should be made by doctors. But are doctors qualified to make these decisions? Well, yes, they can diagnose terminal illness, but the other qualifying criteria, and arguably the ones that really matter, are personal or social, not medical. For example, how settled is a wish to die, whether there's any pressure in the family background. Most doctors simply cannot make informed decisions in these areas, which lie beyond their professional expertise. And this problem is made a lot worse by what I've referred to a few moments ago as doctor shopping. The majority of practicing doctors won't have anything to do with assisted dying. Now, the end result of that is that these life or death decisions would have to be made in many cases by a small number of referral doctors who may be willing to interview applicants for lethal drugs, but they've never met the patient before, and they know nothing of the applicant as a patient. Now, this is exactly what has happened in Oregon. 1/6 of all prescriptions for lethal drugs last year in Oregon was handed out by just one doctor. Now let's come to the third of the bill's flaws, its scope. In the UK, campaigners for assisted dying have limited their ambitions to doctors supplying lethal drugs to terminally ill people to administer to themselves. This is physician-assisted suicide, as distinct from physician-administered euthanasia, where a doctor would inject lethal drugs into a patient. The bill before the Doyle proposes not just the supply of lethal drugs, but their injection by a doctor if the patient cannot self-administer. Now, the bill doesn't define how that condition is supposed to be met. It seems to be open to the discretion of the individual doctor. But if you look at the data from places like Holland and Canada, where injecting lethal drugs has been legalized, you see that the death rate is 10 times what it is in those places that have legalized only lethal prescriptions. In Holland, for example, last year, 1 in 25 of all deaths in the country was the result of either assisted suicide or administered euthanasia, and 96% of those deaths were from injection of lethal drugs, very few from self-administration. Now, why is this? It's hard to be sure, but it could be because receiving a lethal injection has a passive quality about it and doesn't require the resolution and determination of picking up and swallowing lethal drugs does. It may also be because receiving an injection from a doctor has a spurious aura of medical care and compassion about it. Whatever the reason, it's undeniable that the death rate from administered euthanasia is hugely greater than the death rate from assisted suicide. And yet there it is in the Dublin Bill. And now to the last of my 4 flaws in the Dublin Bill. One of its qualifying conditions for lethal drugs is that a person must have resided for at least a year, not in the Republic, as you might have expected, but quote, in the island of Ireland, unquote. Now, I don't want to get caught up here in the constitutional question of whether the Dáil should be considering passing laws for people outside its own territory. Now, I don't mean to imply by this that that isn't an important question. What I'm saying is that whatever the constitutional position, the bill's cross-border provision has the potential to cause some serious problems for Northern Ireland. The most obvious one is that it could be seen as an invitation to euthanasia tourism. Assisted suicide and euthanasia are illegal north of the border. So presumably people living in the north who may want to have their lives ended will have to travel to the south for the purpose. Now, we've seen this problem already with Switzerland and Dignitas, haven't we? But it poses the question, does Northern Ireland want to get into the position of having facilities of this nature on its doorstep? Now, quite apart from this social issue, there are potential legal problems too. For example, what would happen? What would be the position of somebody from the north who went to the Republic, obtained lethal drugs, and brought them back over the border for use at home? As most people say they want to die at home, it seems a likely scenario. And in Oregon, that's where people tend to take lethal drugs. But where would they stand legally? And then there are some serious potential problems for doctors. What would be the legal position of a doctor in, say, Belfast, who referred a patient and his or her medical records to a doctor in Dublin in the knowledge that the patient was seeking assisted suicide or euthanasia? Would the doctor be in breach of Northern Ireland law? Or again, if a doctor in the Republic, with the patient's consent, asked a colleague in the north for a patient's medical records, apparently for reasons of patient care, but those records were subsequently used as a basis for providing lethal drugs, where would the Northern Ireland doctor stand legally? I'm astonished at how little publicity has been given to the Dublin Bill. Though it's a deeply flawed bill, it has sailed through the second reading and into its committee stage in the Dáil. And I've seen so little, or little if any, comment about it in the media. Contrast this with the Westminster scene, where milder bills than this have been the cause of serious controversy both in the media and in Parliament, and they've always been rejected. It simply doesn't make sense. Well, so much for the Irish bill. For the last few minutes, I want to talk about some of the underlying principles of the assisted dying debate in the UK. Now, there's much talk of compassion by the advocates of assisted dying, but the real question, I put it to you, isn't about compassion. Compassion is common currency to both sides of the debate. The real question is whether we should be licensing doctors by law to supply lethal drugs to terminally ill patients for them to use to take their own lives. Yes, we can empathize with the situation of someone who has felt it necessary to help a badly suffering loved one out of this world. But we don't legalize an act just because we can empathize with it in highly exceptional circumstances. I wouldn't want to see a parent prosecuted for breaking the speed limit while rushing a desperately sick child to hospital. I wouldn't want to see a mother who stole for the first time in her life out of desperation to feed her starving family prosecuted. But I don't think I'm alone in saying that I wouldn't want to see dangerous driving or theft licensed in advance and in prescribed circumstances. We expect these laws to be maintained to protect all of us, and we look to see exceptional cases dealt with exceptionally. And that's what happens now in the UK with assisting suicide. The law forbids it, and it holds serious enough penalties in reserve to make anyone contemplating doing it think very carefully indeed before proceeding. But the law also requires that any case that occurs is examined carefully, and for prosecuting decisions to take account of what, if any, criminal intent there has been. In other words, the law combines deterrence with real-world discretion. So what's the result? The result is that assisting suicide is a very rare offence. Throughout the whole of England and Wales, in any 1 year, on average, less than 20 cases are referred to the Crown Prosecution Service. That is a very low level of law-breaking indeed. And thanks to the law's deterrent effect, most of these are cases where the assistance that's been given has been given reluctantly and after much serious soul searching. These are not cases that need to be prosecuted or taken to court. But now look what happens if the law is changed. Let's take Oregon as an example, as that's the model that was being held up to us to follow. Oregon's death rate from legalized assisted suicide last year is the equivalent in England and Wales. I'm sorry, I don't have a figure for Northern Ireland, but it's the equivalent in England and Wales, not of 20 cases a year, but wait for it, 2,500. The reason for this dramatic change is that legalization changes the dynamic completely. Laws are more than just regulatory instruments. They also send social messages. An assisted dying law sends the message, however unintended on the part of legislators, that if we're terminally ill, taking our lives is an acceptable course of action, or at least a course of action worth considering. Now, we've seen this with other pieces of legislation, haven't we? I mean, abortion being a classic example. The impression that the campaigning groups for assisted dying give us is that changing the law would just allow a handful of people to have assistance to take their own lives. But the truth is that enabling laws have a well-known habit of encouraging the acts that they enable. It's all very well to say that assisted dying is only intended for the terminally ill. That position is completely irrational. If the watchword is, as we're told, compassion, then where's the compassion in bringing about the deaths of people who are expecting to die in the next few weeks or months, but refusing it to others who may have years of distress ahead of them? And isn't mental suffering every bit as bad for those who have it as physical suffering? So shouldn't they too be helped to end it all? The plain fact is that assisted dying laws contain within themselves the seeds of their own expansion. Let me quote to you the words of Baroness Elizabeth Butler Sloss, who some years ago was president of the Family Division of the High Court in London. This is how she put it in an article in the press a few years ago. Laws, she said, are like nation states. They are more secure when their boundaries rest on natural frontiers. The law that we have now rests on just such a natural frontier. It rests on the principle that we do not involve ourselves in deliberately bringing about the deaths of other people. Once exceptions are made to that principle, like terminal illness, the boundary of the law becomes just a line in the sand, easily crossed and hard to defend. Don't believe the propaganda that assisted dying is about saving terminally ill people from agonizing deaths. Official reports from Oregon show that top of the list of reasons why people give for seeking lethal drugs isn't pain. That comes well down the list. Top of the list is, and I quote, less able to engage in activities making life enjoyable, unquote. The people who step out of the pages of all these parliamentary bills are typical no-nonsense individuals who know exactly what they're doing, who aren't the sort to be pushed around by anyone else, and who feel frustrated at not having the independence they once had or the death they would like to have. As one witness put it to the Mackay Committee when it visited Oregon in 2004, and I quote her words here, "They find being cared for to be intolerable. They've had a lifetime of needing to be responsible and have learned one way or another not to depend on others, but to be self-sufficient," unquote. The real world just isn't like that. In the real world, most people's experience of life is less about asserting their will and getting their own way, and more about coping with what life throws at them. The existing law may seem by some as a nuisance or an obstacle to having total control over their deaths, but it's there to protect the vulnerable members of society, the majority, from harm, including self-harm. Be in no doubt, an assisted dying law is a law to oblige the strong, not a law to protect the weak. Thank you.
Thank you very